Do you know what another name for an aperture is? The dictionary definition for it is an opening, a hole, or a gap. It then goes on to say that it is a space through which the light passes in an optical or photographic instrument, especially the variable opening by which light enters a camera. So the aperture is a hole through which light passes through the lens, past the shutter, onto the sensor at the back of the camera. Like the shutter, the aperture also works as an instrument by which the light that hits the sensor is measured and controlled. It is often more important in the creation of a correct exposure than the shutter. The aperture is also a moving mechanical part which opens and shuts like a flower, and the interwoven blades of the aperture leave a circular hole through which the light travels. Each lens carries its own aperture, so each lens you buy varies with how much latitude you can get with the aperture. Some lenses are known as fast lenses, and the reason for this is that at a maximum aperture, the lenses will operate extremely well in very low light situations. These lenses are typically much more difficult to manufacture because the distances between the sensor and lens are much more critical. Therefore, they are generally much more expensive. Apertures open up when letting in a maximum amount of light, or stop down when limiting the amount of light to hit the sensor. And once again, if the aperture is opened right up and light is pouring in, then there's a good chance that in normal light conditions, you may overexpose your image. And if it is closed right down, you may not allow enough light to hit the sensor, therefore underexposing the image. In fact, while the shutter and aperture operate in a completely different fashion and create completely different effects on the final photograph, the way each element controls the amount of light hitting the sensor is identical. The aperture is also responsible for the depth of field that is recorded in the photograph. Depth of field is the measurement of the sharpness from the foreground of the photograph to the background of the photograph. The easiest way to explain depth of field is if you stretch your arm out and shut one eye and focus on your thumb. Now, if you're in a bright light area, some distance behind your thumb is still quite sharp. That is, the objects you see behind your thumb are almost as sharp as your thumb itself. If you switch the lights off and continue to focus on your thumb, you will notice that the objects behind your thumb at the same distance to the previous situation seem out of focus or soft. This effect is known as the depth of field. We say a photograph has a short depth of field when a short distance in front and behind the object on which we focus is soft or appears out of focus. When an image is sharp all the way through, from the object in the foreground to the object in the background, including the object you have focused on, then you can say that the photograph has a greater depth of field. Now, the reason this occurs is because the aperture of the eye, the iris, similar to the aperture in a camera, has been opened right up or closed right down. When the aperture has been closed right down, there is less chance of light rays bouncing around inside the camera. When the aperture is wide open, then the occurrence of refraction is highly likely. This scattering of the light rays that we talked about in lesson 3 causes that out of focus effect. The out of focus effect can most commonly be seen in food photography, but can be used for wonderfully creative artistic expressions, often in portraits or in street photography. Aperture is measured in what is known as f-stops. This name derived from the mathematical equation by which the aperture relates to the lens and the distance to the sensor plane. This is known as the focal length of the lens. This is where you see what f-stop you are using. F-stops range anywhere from as low as f1.2 to as high as f32 in most 35mm DSLR lenses. A lens with an f-stop at 1.2 would be considered an extremely fast lens. This means that the aperture would be extremely wide at f1.2. An aperture of f32 is closed down and would only allow a pinprick of light to fall on the sensor. These numbers are shown on most cameras without the F in front of them and generally double as the aperture gets smaller. So an average range of apertures would be something like this: 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, 22, and increments in between. By understanding what an aperture does, even if you are only working with a completely automatic camera, you will understand in low light situations, if you focus on an object, there's a likelihood that the background will appear slightly out of focus, and that you can use this for creative expression. Whereas in bright light, the opposite is true. The shutter and the aperture work in concert with one another and have a reciprocal relationship. This relationship is about how they both affect the amount of light falling on the sensor. In our next lesson, we will look at ISO and what it means and how to get the correct exposure for any image. So until then, happy snapping.